Hello, ethics students. We are at the very end of the semester, and I'm here to bring you great tidings of joy, which is that we are going virtual for this final lecture. And I'm doing it to save the planet because tomorrow, which is Friday, I am not coming to campus in the morning because my daughters have a special school program, and I would need to pick my daughters up early, and that would mean we would have a very short amount of time in class. So I figured, save the planet. I'm going to drive all the way out from Dubuque to Epworth for 20 minutes of class and then drive back. So we're going to finish this PowerPoint online. All right. So where we had left off, we were beginning to explore some of the possibilities that have been raised by process theology and how we can find a proper balance carefully to incorporate some of these new insights while appreciating and still learning from the past. Just because in the past there have been some potential abuses of the sovereign king monarch model of God's divine agency does not mean that we can or should throw out everything. We need to find a way to navigate the past. So with all of that in mind, let's jump right into this slide here. And in that exact same vein, Elizabeth Johnson challenges us to realize that throughout our sacred history, throughout the writings of the saints, there have been these hints, these little pieces of a model of God's authority that is different than absolute total control, like a king ruling over us lowly subjects who have no authority, and the king has all the authority. So Irenaeus very famously said, the glory of God is the human person fully alive. And it's just an important reminder that God wanted us to be happy and wants us to be happy. Go all the way back to the story of the Garden of Eden. God's punishment of Adam and Eve is not intended to just hurt them or make them sad. It is a realistic consequence of the fact that they disobeyed and broke relationship and were impatient with the journey that they were going on. They wanted to jump ahead in the same way that I would never put my daughter Lillian behind the controls of a space shuttle because she hadn't been trained to understand how to operate it. God didn't want to put humans in a position where they would continue to walk freely around in the earth after they made the mistake of sin, because the wages of sin is death. That sin needed to have a consequence, and that consequence's purpose was not just to punish, but to illuminate. In the end, it is a blessed fall. It is not God getting angry or upset or having a tantrum or something, right? And I am a big fan of seeing sin first and foremost as breaking relationship, and then second as breaking a law or a rule or going against God's authority. I think relationship always comes first, and good rules and healthy authority to subject dynamics, those things come out of healthy relationships. It's not the other way around. Bernard of Clairvaux also advanced this sort of both and view of causality. He was influenced by the infamous Chartres school. And it's kind of cool that I'm in my office and I wasn't planning to do this, but I have my little shelf here, which is my Middle Ages shelf. I have my early church shelf, Middle Ages shelf, and modern shelf. This book is called Nature, Man, to the Humans, and Society, the 12th Century. And it talks about a renaissance that happened in the 12th century. And you can kind of see the picture here. Kind of the whole point of this book is to show how it is during this time, and this is around, these are the people that influenced Bernard of Clairvaux. It is around this time that theologians and philosophers started to assign nature its own integrity in causality and say, look, nature has its own realm of causes, and God gave nature that realm, and it is a free gift. It has integrity, and we can start to study it and learn about it. And we don't need to have divine theological revelation. We don't need that to understand everything about nature. In fact, nature is its own book that reveals something of God. And the book of Scripture and the book of nature, they harmonize. But the book of nature has its own integrity. And so Bernard Clairvaux, he said, not only this, but also when it comes to divine and human agency, quote, it is not as if grace does half of the work and then free choice does the other half, but each does the whole. Somehow, paradoxically, God can be 100% perfect, while also humans can be 100% free. And we have to wrestle with that. We have to discern how those two things that seem to be the opposite can be true at once. According to the peculiar contribution of each, right? It's not a all or nothing, black and white, zero sum game. You know, it's about integrity of each being according to its capacities. And God is the kind of being that has ultimate integrity, and that integrity dictates that through the goodness of creation, God donates choice. God creates in God's image and thereby allows or enables, and this is exactly what we're going to look at. What model can we speak of this gift of God that has allowed creation to have its own choice and its own integrity? So we're going to go on to the next slide then to answer that question. So our author Elizabeth Johnson proposes that God's creative activity brings into being a universe that is given or endowed the innate capacity to evolve by the operation of its own natural powers. Again, its own realm of causes, making it a free partner in its own creation. Just like in your life, you influence your own growth and development. You make choices that lead you down a certain path. And yet many choices at the same time are also beyond your control. And there are certain things that are done for you or to you. And Johnson is proposing here, what if the whole universe is like that? What if this entire cosmos, this realm that we live in, with its wonders, its galaxies, all these things, has been given by God the capacity to go on its own journey, to evolve, and to be an agent in its own development? Very interesting. This is not, however, the same position as deism, which is depicted in this picture, that God would just kind of take a rest, right? Deism is the notion that God leaves the world to its own devices like a clock, wound up and left by itself. This is different than that, because this is saying God gives the world the capacity to evolve and grow and allows the world to come into relationship, not with some absent sleeping being, but with the very ground of being itself, the source and the summit of existence. The Spirit, of course, very difficult to define, the Holy Spirit, but a simple way to put it is that it is God's motion in the world, right? It is more subtle than any motion. And the activity of the Holy Spirit is revealed by the Christ event, a transformative revelation that rolls over into all other contexts. And if we're going to be good Catholics, if we're going to really take seriously the incarnation, crucifixion, and the resurrection, these kinds of world-changing events, then we need to apply our knowledge from those events to other disciplines, other areas of life. God is not just the ground of being, but also the dynamic ground of becoming. Divine love ultimately enhances the powers of the human person and of creation, rather than being a zero-sum game in which one's protagonist gain is the other's loss, right? You know, it's amazing to think about this, but in our world, sometimes we just can't help but feel that there's a competition for winning someone's heart or mind or convincing someone. It's all about who wins and who loses, you know? who has more and who has less, whether those are physical resources, intelligence, any of these things. But in the divine economy, there's only one source of everything. And there is a offer that is extended to creation to participate more and more and to dive deeper and deeper into that source of every good and perfect gift. The gifts that God gives are the kinds of gifts that do not decrease as they are given away. They increase as they are given away. So then we get to sort of the final part of this that we're going to look at today. And I encourage you to go and finish reading the whole chapter, even though I wasn't able to make lecture content that covers the whole chapter. I encourage you to go continue reading it because it's really good and it's up there on Populi. What models could we use to describe this way of God's interaction? So first, there is the omnipotence model. Or first, we have to define omnipotence, I guess. In the past, some people have tried to define God's all-powerful nature, omnipotence, as if this means that God is controlling everything all the time. And Elizabeth Johnson correctly says that is not really the Catholic position. The omnipotence of God can be thought of only as the power of divine love, not as the assertion of particular royal authority against all opposition, right? God's power is not the same kind of power that a tyrant or even a ruler on this earth has. You know, Jesus is very clear that the kingdom is not of this world. God's power is only vaguely reminiscent of human power. So the metaphors of authority and sovereignty and royal power and all this stuff, these can be problematic in loaded terms, especially if you're talking about a corrupt authority or a corrupt monarchy. And I think we don't have to look very far. You know, I mean, an example that you would all be familiar with would be the monarchy of the British Empire. And especially for just one thing that comes to mind, how they treated the people of India. And then how would we witness to those people and tell them, oh, by the way, you know that king on earth, King George or whoever he was, right? I think about King Philip. The Philippines, we talked about this. They're named after King Philip, but he never even went to the Philippines. Whole country named after him, right? How are we supposed to tell people, oh yeah, you know that? That's like God. God is like a king. And people are like, wait a minute, I have very bad associations with kings. So you're going to tell me that God is like something bad that I am traumatized by, or that has killed members of my family, or has oppressed my people? Is that what God is like? No. So as Johnson puts it, in controlling, manipulative, fearful, narcissistic, and egoistic relations, one party is trying to gain an advantage by bending the other to their will, you know, is trying to use these tools of persuasion to get what they want at the expense of someone else. And again, if we look up here, we can't think of God's sovereignty and power in that way. They are related to love, not related to narcissism or egoism, or, you know, this notion of like God is trying to prevent us from being creatures, right? God just wants us to all become robots. That's not true. The core integrity of the other is disrespected by ploys that tend to dominate. Whereas, by contrast, mature love moves in the opposite direction. You know, it really does. And I know this as a parent, you know, I want my children to grow up to have their own views. I want to be able to talk to them person to person. I want to respect them, even as I am trying to guide them. I want to also respect them. It's not one or the other. It's not all my way or all their way, but there has to be a foundation of love, which involves respect. Love has to involve respect. It has to show fruit, right? Love is known by its fruits. So if we rejoice when someone that we love flourishes and learns and changes and grows, right? I rejoice when my students do these things. How much more would God rejoice when all of creation evolves? Because it's a journey of change, growth, learning, flourishing. I think it's a really good case. It's a really good place at least to begin our reflections on creation and evolution. Just want to make sure that the recording is going here. I think it is. Oh, hope it is. I think it is. So next slide, we just got a couple left here. Life's development, which scientists trace back billions of years, while unpredictable in advance, can be understood in retrospect with our power of hindsight as the working out of innate properties with which the universe was gifted from the beginning. Very similar, as I talked about last time in class, to Augustine's, I think, it was that class, maybe not, Augustine's theory of the seminal reasons that God plants the seeds. And that over time, very long periods of time, these seeds start to grow. So as such, we can now examine models for describing God's interaction with the world. And I like to cite Augustine because he's an ancient thinker and a foundational thinker for Catholic theology. And yet many people today still don't grasp or understand his ideas about creation and that it took place over a very long, unspecified period of time. And people were all surprised when science and many Catholic scientists, right? We have our own Pontifical Academy of Sciences. People were surprised when scientists started to realize how old the Earth is and how old the universe is. And it's like, well, if you would have read Augustine more carefully, maybe you wouldn't be so surprised. I wonder if I have the Augustine book. Nope. Okay, so I'm 1 for 2. That book is at home. All right. So all of these models that we're going to look at are attempting to avoid this idea that is called the God of the gap. And in that idea, you kind of just say, well, we don't understand something, and so that must be God. I don't understand that, so that must be God. It's not really fair to humans or to God to do that, you know? And if you look back to the past, whenever people have done that, it's usually not ended up being correct. Like, for example, someone who is born blind. Oh, we don't understand why this person is born blind, so it must be God. We want to avoid that, right? And Jesus is very clear what he thinks about that. So we've got 6 models that we're going to look at. I think there might be 2 or 3 more slides. So there's this slide, and there's that slide, and then there's the conclusion. Okay. So we're going to look at 6 models. We're going to look at 3 of them that focus more on how God is in charge. And then we're going to look at 3 that focus more on creaturely agency. And, you know, we don't have time to talk about all of these in extreme detail. So I'm just going to do my best to give a basic overview. And if you want to learn more about these, you know, buy her book, Ask the Beasts. That would be a good place to start, is to just read her whole book. All right. So models that focus more on the divine agency. One of them is single action theory. It calls God the capital A agent whose intention is carried out in the overall development of the universe rather than in the particulars. So this intention is sort of behind the big picture. I think Teilhard de Chardin would kind of fall into this because he talked about how evolution is moving toward a Christ event, which is the second coming, and that God's intention is to bring all things back together into Christ, and that is going to happen. So the whole evolutionary development can be interpreted as one all-encompassing action, right? Everything comes from God, everything returns to God. Very traditional Neoplatonic view could be put into dialogue with this new view, right? You can kind of say everything comes from God, everything returns to God. Here is how it happens. Next, we have top-down causality. I'm not as big of a fan of this one. I don't know. I just don't really like the way it's phrased, like above and below. It might be a little bit too dualistic, potentially Gnostic, in used in the very general sense. So this theory articulates how God influences the world the same way that a pattern or a blueprint influences the final project, like a quilt or a house. God both patterns and influences the world through the word. I think that this type of idea was actually done a lot more accurately and a lot more orthodoxy, that's not the right word, in a lot more of an orthodox fashion by the scholastics when they talk about divine ideas and the relationship that we looked at briefly in Disputed Questions on the Knowledge of Christ between illumination and exemplarity. So this, I mean, there's nothing new under the sun. None of these ideas are like totally new. But I think this one's actually done better through, a metaphysical framework. And I think it's just so Platonic the way it's written that it's best to kind of look to the past for an example of this one. That would just be my subjective opinion. Finally, in terms of the first set of views where God is portrayed as having the first focus in terms of agency, we have causal joint theory, claims that God inserts divine influence at significant hinge points in open systems. So God allows these systems to be open, right? God is not saying, all right, I'm going to control every aspect of this. God's allowing creation to have its own freedom, but at certain points, God pushes a little bit, says, boop, 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 right? And actualizes or makes real one of many possibilities. And perhaps this occurs at the quantum level through phenomena such as entanglement. That's my speculation. I like that one a lot. I think that one's really interesting and would be kind of fun to place into dialogue with like the Hebrew scriptures conception of God as, intervening in specific moments to change the course of history. All right, keep moving. We've got 3 more, and these ones first focus on the integrity of the creature. Doesn't mean that they are that they limit the integrity or the power of God. Doesn't mean that, but it means the creature is more of their starting point. So we have the organic model, holds that divine presence acts with transcendent immanence in and through the actions of human beings. I needed for Dr. Elizabeth Johnson to explain that one a little bit more. I don't have a whole lot to add about it because it seems very paradoxical. Transcendent immanence, I would speculate that it has something to do with the uniqueness of human being, suspended as we are between action and possibility and made in God's image. And that somehow we are bringing about the coming of the kingdom is maybe the way to see this one. Next, we have the kenotic position. This is a really interesting one. It perceives that God voluntarily self-limits divine power, which we do see in the person of Jesus Christ. So there is confirmation from revelation of Scripture that this does happen. Perhaps it also happens in the revelation of nature. So God limits God's own power in order to participate vulnerably in the life of the world. I was just talking in my Christology class this morning about how in order for you to have a real relationship with someone, there needs to be an exchange of vulnerability. It can't just remain on the surface level where everything's safe. There needs to be an honest sharing of truth about yourself that someone else could take advantage of. You have to be willing to put yourself out there and say, yeah, I have made these mistakes, or I have this weakness. And you are taking a risk when you do that, that someone could use that vulnerability against you and talk about you behind your back, or, make fun of you or whatever. But you're not going to be able to have a real relationship with someone if you do not listen to their vulnerability and give yours to them as well. And so perhaps in some mysterious way, it wouldn't be exactly like humans, right? Perhaps in some mysterious way, God is doing something similar, where God is opening up something to us and trusting us to say, hey, here is my love. And yes, God understands that we might abuse that. And in fact, we often do. But nonetheless, God still wants to have a real relationship with us. And so God, in a way, trusts us, which, I'm glad that God is optimistic and not pessimistic. All right, last one here. We got process thought, just straight up, it's like, this is the big one, right? Process thought is really what a lot of people have been wrestling with for the last 40 years or so in the theology, when we talk about divine and human agency. And it's this whole new way of thinking. It's been around for longer than 40 years. Get one of these books I've got here. Where is it? This is a hallmark of process theology. It's called Omnipotence and Other Classic Theological Mistakes by Charles Hartshorne, published in 1984. You know, and this book goes through and it says, look, the way that we have understood God's perfection, God's omnipotence, God's omniscience, God's unsympathetic or detached goodness, all of these things, it just basically says we're understanding them wrong. It is very controversial, right? So process theology, it envisions a God who is a creative participant in the cosmic community, who acts in and through all events by means of influence or persuasion. Now, in my Causality class, we talked about how, even in the framework of the scholastics, God governs and regulates and influences. This is taking it to a whole new level and is basically saying that God is involved much more deeply in the growth and the change of the universe. And it does challenge those notions of divine aseity, this, which is the idea that God doesn't need anything and God is, perfectly transcendent and, didn't need to create and detached and all this stuff, right? For better or worse, it challenges that. And so in this model, God lures the world in a desired direction toward new possibilities of a richer life together. So I'll let you folks decide what you think about that. You've probably heard me draw something from this metaphor before. I try to find ways to take these new ideas and balance them with tradition, because I do think that even in the classical metaphysical understanding of the word as the divine speech, the divine ideas of God, there is perhaps room for thinking about possibilities of freedom and choice being laid out for us by God, through that power of the word, God working in a way with us, cooperating as we do with God. I mean, is it such a stretch to say that God also works with us? I mean, clearly God worked with us by sending God's son. The question is there a way to see God's work throughout all of creation, not just in the Christ event, but using the Christ event as a key to unlock how God relates to the universe? So, conclusion, God is the beginning, sustaining power, and goal of the evolving world, who acts by empowering the process from within. That's one way to summarize all these different views, is that God's action is not just coming from above, like, but that it is deeply, in some way, we don't know how to fully describe it, but it is deeply involved with creaturely being. And again, God's not the kind of God that just wants to control everything, manipulate things, create mindless robots. So I hope you all had a wonderful semester. I enjoyed being your professor for ethics, the first time I've ever taught ethics. So thank you for being patient with me on this journey of the first time going through something. And I'll look forward to reading your course evaluations, to see if there's any feedback that you have that might be valuable if I ever teach this class again. And I will be seeing you all very soon, I am sure. And enjoy the beautiful weather today. Email me if you need anything.